Hi, science students. Welcome to my screencast about inheritance. Um, in my arms is a 4-week-old little boy. This is Landon, and I'm going to help him illustrate some genetics concepts that hopefully you started learning about already, and that we're going to continue talking about later. If you look at this beautiful little baby, you're going to notice that he has several traits like dark hair and a certain type of nose, a certain type of complexion. These are traits that in some ways resemble me, his father, and other ways resemble his mother. And they are all genetic traits, inherited traits. Um, One thing that I want to point out is his genotype, the genes that determine his inherited traits. Half of his genes have been contributed by the father, me, and then the other half of his genes that make up his genotype were contributed by his mother. And I want to use Landon for one specific phenotype. There's one trait I want to look at in particular, and then I'll put this little guy down. Landon has something called a widow's peak. And if you look at where your hairline meets your forehead, a widow's peak means that there's a little point. So I'll show you a picture later, but you can kind of see it here. Right where Landon's forehead meets his hair, he has a pointed widow's peak. I do not have that phenotype. I am Landon's father, and my hairline is pretty much straight. So I want to talk a little bit about a big question, a guided question, or a guiding question that we're gonna look at through this screencast is it possible for parents to predict how likely certain traits might appear in their offspring? So before Landon was born, could me and his mom have predicted how likely his widow's peak phenotype would have been? Okay, I'm back. So, in answering this big question, it's important that we take a step back and look at what our genes are made of. So, if you remember that all living things are made out of cells, and inside of the nucleus of every cell is something known as a chromosome. And chromosomes are structures, they are raveled up bundles that, if you unravel them, contain something I'm sure you've heard of, which is the DNA. The DNA makes up anything that's alive. It's genetic information that determines the inherited traits, and the sections of these our DNA strands are referred to as genes. So as you can imagine, if you think of all of the DNA that is bundled up in every single one of our cells, we are composed of thousands, millions of genes, many, many genes. In terms of chromosomes, however, humans only have a certain number of chromosomes. Healthy human beings have 46 chromosomes within within the nucleus of every cell in their body. It is important to note that, and I'm referring to a movie that you may have seen before, all of our body cells have our genetic information. In other words, looking at the science fiction movie Jurassic Park, the way that the scientists were able to bring back, I know that this is science fiction, but some of this scientific information is accurate. The blood of dinosaurs was preserved in a piece of amber from a mosquito bite, apparently. But the blood of the dinosaur contains all of the genetic information, like how large the dinosaur will be, the color of its scales, etc. Your blood cells, your hair cells, your skin cells contain all of your genetic information as well. So somebody could determine your hair color, your natural eye color, etc., all of your inherited traits based on the genes in any of your cells. So I'm getting to this big question, but I just want to refer to one word that might be new to you. You know what the word mitosis means. You know that when your fingernails grow, when your skin cells grow, when your hair grows, your cells need to make more of each other. And when they reproduce, that term is called mitosis. There is a different term which refers to sexually reproducing organisms, and that word is meiosis. It sounds similar, it's a little bit different. Meiosis means that a normal body cell, which has 46 chromosomes in human beings, basically divides in half. So in making reproductive cells, sperm cells for the male or egg cells for the female, each of these reproductive cells has 23 chromosomes instead of 46. That makes a lot of sense because a healthy human being like you needs to have 46 chromosomes, and you have inherited 23 chromosomes from your biological father, and you have inherited 23 chromosomes from your biological mother. So you have 23 pairs. This is one chromosome pair. You have 23 pairs, which would make 46 total chromosomes in all of your body cells. Now, if we go back to our main question and just kind of now that I put the baby down, we can talk a little bit more about that phenotype, which was Landon's widow's peak, right? And like we said, he has an inherited half of his chromosomes from me, his father, and half of his chromosomes from his mother, and this would compose his genotype, the genes that determine his physical traits. And one section of the chromosome would make one gene that determines his hairline. Okay, so baby Landon has a widow's peak, and that is because the genes are interacting in a certain way, which I'll explain in a little bit. So let's look at Landon's mom's genotype. There are two alleles, or there are two variations of this particular type of phenotype of this trait. You either have a widow's peak or you do not. So my allele, I do not have that variation. Landon and his mother do have this trait. They do have the allele of a widow's peak. A widow's peak is something that is a dominant trait. And looking at the mom's genotype, by the way, if you see a capital and a lowercase letter, the word that geneticists use is heterozygous. Hopefully you've used that word a little bit. We will use it more in the future, but a good point of reference right now. Heterozygous means one capital dominant gene and one lowercase gene. So Landon's mom has one capital and one lowercase gene for widow's peak. She has at least one dominant gene. So if you think of the word dominance, if you dominate on the football field, if you dominate in the classroom, that means that you outperform other individuals in that room. If somebody has one dominant gene, one capital allele for that trait, the person will express the dominant phenotype. They will show the dominant trait, whatever that happens to be. Let's look at me. This representation shows my genotype. I have two recessive alleles, and they are represented by lowercase letters. So my genotype would be homozygous, because they are the same, homozygous recessive. For that reason, I do not express the dominant phenotype. I do not have a widow's peak, whereas my wife and my son do have a widow's peak because of their genes, because they have expressed at least one dominant letter, one dominant allele. So let's take a look at these two pictures here. Let's say that here is a mother. Her genotype is capital W and lowercase w, right? Here are her chromosomes. This gene codes for widow's peak. I know this picture is a little bit simplistic, but it gets the job done. And this woman's phenotype is that she does have the widow's peak. So the genes are represented by the genotype. The physical traits, the physical feature, if you think of the word phenomenon, the phenomenon or the phenotype, she does have the widow's peak. Let's say that her husband, like me, is homozygous recessive. This father does not have a widow's peak. His phenotype is the recessive phenotype. He does not have a widow's peak. So let's go back to that question that we started with. Can parents predict how likely their traits will be present in their offspring? In this case, yes, you can. And we can find out how likely these two individuals will, how likely it is that their child will have a widow's peak. And I'll show you how. The tool that you're going to use is something called a Punnett square. You may have seen it already. I think I misspelled it. It's probably supposed to have a second T, but that's okay. It doesn't matter. So you have this, oh, it almost looks like a window frame to me. You have this big window, and then you have those little, breaking off sections, a section of 4. And in setting up your Punnett square, what you do is you take the genotype of the father. Remember, the dad, which represents me, is homozygous recessive. Remember that word meiosis? Meiosis means that the chromosomes are divided in half. If a sperm cell had 46 chromosomes, then the child would have 92. That's way too many. So half of the genes would go on one to the side of one of these sides of the square, and then the other gene travels down here. For the mother, she is heterozygous. She has one dominant and one recessive. One of mom's egg cells goes here, and the other egg cell possibility goes here. What the Punnett square does for us, it's kind of like a mathematical concept or a mathematical tool. It shows us every possible combination of egg and sperm cells for this particular couple, and I'm going to show you how that gets determined. Whoops. Well, let me get my arrows here. Sorry. Okay, I jumped ahead. Sorry about that. Here's how you're going to fill out your Punnett square. You start with the first gene here. It's a dominant gene. And what you do, just like in lattice math, is you transfer that capital gene to the first square. I'm pulling this letter down. Then I pull that same letter down to this second window, right? So it's almost like that letter is being translated to these two other boxes. Now, the mother can also donate a lowercase or a recessive gene. And here's the recessive gene right here. And just like the steps that I did over here, I'm going to represent the mother's contribution down here. So I see mom can either contribute a capital W, she can contribute the dominant trait, or she can contribute the recessive trait. Now the father, remember, is homozygous recessive. He can only contribute one type of gene, the lowercase w. So if we go from here, now we're going to go left to right. Dad goes from left to right here, and then that lowercase w gets transferred to the side as well. Let's go to the second possible reproductive cell. An egg with a dominant gene could meet, right? Could fuse with a sperm cell that has the lowercase, the recessive gene. And if I do the same thing over here, there we go. There's our window. So let's use some terminology to describe what we have in these boxes. In this box, you have a heterozygous combination of an egg and a sperm cell. In this box, you have a heterozygous combination of an egg and a sperm cell. In this box, you have a homozygous recessive combination. You also have a homozygous recessive combination here. This gives us a probability. Okay, so if you think of each box representing 25%, this is telling us the probability that the child might inherit certain traits based on the genes of the mother and the father. So if we wanted to answer this question right here, what is the likelihood that this couple will have a child with a widow's peak? What you want to look for is the dominant genotype. So I see that there is a dominant gene, there is a dominant letter in this genotype. There is a dominant letter in this genotype. 2 out of my 4 possible babies have a widow's peak. So the percentage, the likelihood, I like to put it into a percentage. That helps me. 50%. So the odds of this couple having a baby with a widow's peak, which is a dominant trait, is 50%. And I determined that because I know 2 out of the 4 possible windows show a child having a widow's peak. Okay, we're going to practice this concept, but if you need to refer to this screencast to remember some vocabulary or to practice some of the basics of filling out a Punnett square, please do that. I hope this is helpful as you fill out your Google form as well. Thank you.